catch me howling at the moon.
In 1996, Six Flags Over Texas opened Runaway Mountain, an indoor sit-down roller coaster built by Premier Rides, a new roller coaster manufacturer based out of Baltimore. The coaster opened to rave reviews for its family-friendly yet thrilling ride experience and is still a staple at the park today. Runaway Mountain would be the beginning of a long relationship between Six Flags, which was owned by Time Warner at the time, and Premier Rides, as Premier has installed 9 of their coasters at Six Flags parks ever since. After the success that Batman the Ride had brought to Great America, Great Adventure, Magic Mountain, and St. Louis in the mid-90s, Time Warner was hoping to come up with another high-capacity, thrilling roller coaster that they could clone at their Six Flags parks. With Premier's successful and well-received installment of Runaway Mountain, Time Warner turned to them to come up with the next Batman the Ride type of hit roller coaster for the Six Flags parks. In 1996, Six Flags announced the addition of 3 more Premier Rides coasters to open at their parks for the 1997 season. Six Flags Great Adventure would be receiving Batman and Robin the Chiller, dueling launch shuttle loop coasters, while Six Flags St. Louis and Six Flags Over Texas would be getting cloned launch shuttle loop coasters themed to Batman villain Mr. Freeze. All 3 new coasters would utilize Premier's LIM launch technology, which had debuted in 1996 on the Flight of Fear coasters at 2 Paramount parks, Kings Island and Kings Dominion. These coasters showed a lot of promise to not only be eye-catching and thrilling additions, but also to be people eaters for the high-attended parks, with the rides featuring a dual loading station that allowed for a theoretical capacity of 1,300 riders per hour. Time Warner had a lot of faith in Premier Rides and moved quickly on plans to add more launch coasters to other Six Flags parks in the near future, and they had one park specifically in mind to be next in 1998.
Make a splash, take a stand. That new coaster's really grand. We're gonna really rock.
The 1990s were a busy time for Six Flags Great America, located in the village of Gurnee, Illinois. In 1990, they kicked the decade off with a bang by opening Iron Wolf, the first ever roller coaster built by Swiss manufacturer Bolliger & Mabillard, now one of the leading manufacturers in the industry. In 1992, they made another big splash with B&M by opening Batman the Ride, the world's first ever inverted roller coaster. 1995 would see the addition of Viper, an in-house wooden coaster that was a clone of the Coney Island Cyclone. In 1996, Viper would become part of a new area of the park called Southwest Territory, which opened 4 flat rides and received another large investment with Giant Drop in 1997. Despite these additions, Six Flags Great America was still far from being the thrill destination it is today. At the beginning of the 1997 season, the park had just 7 coasters: Whizzer, Demon, American Eagle, Shockwave, Iron Wolf, Batman the Ride, and Viper. However, plans were already well on their way for the park's next coaster, which promised to be their biggest and baddest yet. Six Flags Great America had a public hearing scheduled with the Village of Gurnee Zoning Board of Appeals for June 25, 1997. Due to a zoning agreement dating back to when the park was founded in 1976, Great America is not allowed to build any structure over the height of 125 feet without the village's permission. The agenda for Great America's portion of the meeting read as follows: petition of Six Flags Great America for a height variance to allow a portion of a new roller coaster ride to reach a maximum height of 225 feet. Six Flags Great America is seeking to introduce a new roller coaster attraction in the wilderness-themed area near the Iron Wolf ride. There were no further details given on the proposed coaster, as Great America only has to get the max height approved by the village and isn't typically required to disclose any other details. But the most widely accepted theory, backed by both park historians and former employees, was that Great America was in line to receive a Mr. Freeze clone in 1998. Others have speculated that it could have been an early iteration of Raging Bull, or a ride like Medusa, but both the B&M Floorless and Hyper models didn't debut until 1999, and this coaster was clearly planned for 1998. The 225-foot height proposed for this coaster matches closely with the 218-foot height of the Mr. Freeze coasters at Over Texas and St. Louis. Plus, there was a plot of unutilized land that existed at that time between the back half of Iron Wolf and the entrance to Loggers Run in the Yukon Territory section of the park. and while this land was decently sized, it definitely couldn't have fit a hyper or a large-scale floorless coaster. This is satellite imagery from 2008 when Iron Wolf was still standing at the park. The Mr. Freeze layout could have fit into the open area of land in multiple ways, depending on where the park wanted to put the entrance, launch, and outdoor portion of the ride. It also could have been potentially built without knocking down the Wilderness Theater. Time Warner had big plans for the Mr. Freeze clones and hoped that the model, with its high theoretical capacity and reasonable $10 million price tag, was going to be the Six Flags chain's next great attendance-driving cloned roller coaster. And all the evidence leads to the conclusion that in the spring of 1997, Six Flags Great America was likely in the final stages of planning to construct a Mr. Freeze clone for the 1998 season.
It's the 8-coaster challenge at Six Flags Great America. 8 of the most heart-stopping, gut-wrenching coasters ever assembled in one place.
Meanwhile in New Jersey, Six Flags Great Adventure's new coaster, Batman and Robin the Chiller, opened to the public on June 7, 1997. However, the Chiller would open for just a few days before experiencing multiple problems with the linear induction motors that would cause the ride to close indefinitely. Similarly, the Mr. Freeze clones at both Over Texas and St. Louis had finished construction, but sat standing but not operating as the parks frantically tried to solve similar issues with the LIM launch mechanism. Months into the 1997 season, none of Six Flags' 3 new Premier Rides coasters were in operating shape and showed little promise to open anytime soon. 2.5 weeks later, on the night of June 25, 1997, Great America held their meeting with the Gurnee Zoning Board to propose their plans for their new 225-foot coaster. The next morning, an article was published in the Chicago Tribune outlining that Six Flags had decided to pull their proposal to build their new from 1998 coaster. In a letter to the Gurnee Zoning Board, Six Flags Vice President Michael Forster wrote, "At this time, it appears unlikely that the attraction will be constructed." The letter did not provide a reason for why the ride was canceled. Typically, Great America only goes in for a height approval for attractions that have been green-lighted by corporate, and an approval from the Village Zoning Board is usually one of the final stages of making a new ride a reality. There have been very few instances in park history where an attraction proposed to the village hasn't ended up being constructed, which means this wasn't just a coaster that they were thinking about adding. This project had real legs behind it and was in the final stages of approval. So why did Great America pull their Mr. Freeze plans at the 11th hour? The issues Six Flags was experiencing with the LIM launches on Batman and Robin the Chiller at Great Adventure and Mr. Freeze at Over Texas and St. Louis weren't temporary. They would last for the duration of the 1997 season. Besides Batman and Robin the Chiller opening for just a few days in June, none of the 3 premier launch coasters would open at all for the 1997 season. This was a PR nightmare for the Six Flags chain, which had marketed the rides extensively along with the opening of the Batman and Robin film that was released in June of that year, as all 3 of the coasters were loosely themed to the movie. Six Flags had put a lot of faith in a relatively new manufacturer, and when the chain's 3 biggest attractions experienced so many problems early on, Time Warner decided to pull the plug on the new projects that they had planned with Premier Rides for 1998. The timing of the difficulties with the LIM launches ended up being very unfortunate for Six Flags Great America, as they missed out on one of the most unique and thrilling coasters in the chain, and if the plans had gone through, Mr. Freeze would still be one of the best coasters in the park to this day. Although the Chiller was consistently plagued with issues that ultimately led to the ride closing in 2007, the 2 Mr. Freeze clones are still operating 23 years later at both Over Texas and St. Louis. After Premier was able to solve some of the more lingering issues with the LIM launch systems before the start of the 1998 season, Six Flags opened up 2 more Premier launch coasters, Joker's Jinx at Six Flags America and Poltergeist at Fiesta Texas in 1999. After pulling plans for adding Mr. Freeze, Time Warner moved quickly on finding a replacement attraction for Great America for the 1998 season. Great America still ended up receiving a roller coaster in 1998, but it definitely wasn't the size or scale of their original plan. In 1998, Six Flags Great America debuted Camp Cartoon Network, a kids area with 5 new rides, including a Vekoma Jr. coaster, Spacely Sprocket Rockets, the park's 9th roller coaster and first real kiddie coaster since the removal of Golf Coaster in the park's opening year.
Face Raging Bull, the fierce first of its kind, high-twisting hypercoaster.
Getting Mr. Freeze in 1998 certainly would have changed the course of history for Six Flags Great America, but how would it have affected the park's future coasters? The next major coaster that Great America would receive was Raging Bull the following year in 1999. Some have speculated that because Great America was in line to receive a Mr. Freeze clone in 1998, that Raging Bull was actually planned for Six Flags St. Louis for 1999, in the spot where the boss eventually ended up. This speculation has been backed by the fact that there has been Raging Bull merch spotted at St. Louis over the years. However, this was likely just a printing error, because many park historians have shut down this rumor, claiming that Raging Bull was designed specifically for Great America. This makes sense because Southwest Territory was still a new area of the park that had plenty of room for a big coaster. Plus, Six Flags adding coasters in back-to-back years at a park like Great America wouldn't have been too out of the ordinary at the time, as the chain added 21 coasters to its parks in 1999. However, I do think it's possible that Mr. Freeze being built could have pushed back the Raging Bull project a few years, and Great America could have received a later version of B&M Hyper, like Nitro at Great Adventure or Goliath at Over Georgia, or possibly even an Intamin or Giovanola Hyper, which were also popular in the chain in the early 2000s. But a park the size of Great America would have almost certainly received a Hyper sooner rather than later, even if they built Mr. Freeze just a few years prior. Another year that could have been significantly affected was 2001, when Great America received two coasters, an Intamin Impulse Coaster, V2, and a Vekoma Inverted Boomerang, Deja Vu. With V2 being an LIM launch coaster and Deja Vu being a shuttle coaster, Mr. Freeze would have filled the need for both of those types of coasters at Great America 3 years prior, so it's unlikely that the park would have received both, or even one of these rides. Plans for the addition of Goliath in 2014 also would have needed to be modified, as Goliath's first and final overbank turn extends out further into Yukon territory than Iron Wolf's layout did, and likely would have interfered with Mr. Freeze's overbank turn or top hat. Another coaster that could have been altered due to the existence of Mr. Freeze would have come all the way in 2019 with Max Force. With Mr. Freeze being a traditional sit-down inverting launch coaster, there would really be no reason for Great America to add another coaster like that down the line, especially considering the two other Mr. Freeze coasters are still in pretty good shape to this day. In all likelihood, Six Flags Great America ended up losing out on getting a Mr. Freeze clone in 1998, and while it wasn't a decision that would doom the park going forward, it's natural to wonder what Great America would be like today with a 225-foot tall coaster dominating the skyline in the back of the park. This wouldn't be the last time that Six Flags Great America had a sudden change of plans with a major roller coaster, as 13 years later, in June of 2010, the park would go back to the Gurney Zoning Board and get approval for a 150-foot tall coaster from B&M, another major roller coaster that would never be built at the park.